the Vietnamese. The 2000 census counted close to 50,000 foreign-born Asian Indians in the DFW area, and just over 47,000 Vietnamese. By the 2010 census, there were over 100,000 Asian Indians and just under 72,000 foreign-born Vietnamese. Just an indication also of that post 9/11 and the sort of importance of immigration continuing actually in the first decade of the 21st century. We did some mapping of these populations, and I don't know how well you can see that at the back of the room, but if you pay attention to the white dots, so if you see just where all that white is on the map, that's the settlement of Asian Indians in the DFW area. The sort of black line, the area that says Dallas, and then there's a large black line, that's the city of Dallas, and you've got the larger metropolitan area. But you can kind of see that the Indians have settled a lot in the suburbs surrounding, to the north of the city of Dallas. The city of Plano, if you see that on the map, it's very small, probably way in the back of the room, but it was one of the fastest growing suburbs in America, in the United States. It's also very high rent. Housing prices are higher than a lot of other suburbs, and certainly different from Farmers Branch. But that's the way that they settled in this kind of arc around the actual city of Dallas itself. And here's the Vietnamese settlement patterns with some more nodes. So if you look at Arlington, where Deborah concentrated a lot of her research, she worked on the Vietnamese, I worked on the Asian Indians, and then Garland, if you can see those on the map. I'm sorry, we can't go around with a laser pointer, but they're slightly more enclaved and more concentrated than are the Asian Indians. So these different settlement patterns of different immigrant populations. We have maps for the others, but I didn't bring them. But those are kind of important things to look at. And then here are just some statistics on the sort of differences between these two populations. One might ask, why did you compare these two populations? Well, they're the two largest Asian populations, but they're very different in interesting ways. Because, of course, the Vietnamese have largely come in under refugee status. The Asian Indians are economic migrants, education migrants. There are obviously differences in level of education, inability to speak English, and the kind of human capital dimensions of these two populations. So they're sort of different on paper, on the ground, and yet we found that when we look at civic engagement and the kind of communities of practice, that they're operating sometimes in quite similar ways with some very subtle differences. So that made it interesting. So in the remainder of my time, I want to talk about some examples of these communities of practice for civic engagement amongst Asian Indians, the desire to temper that Muslim, Hindu, or Hindu nationalist kind of issues that characterize India and the Indian American population, at least in the Dallas area. That is not true of some other cities, and that's where the city as context becomes important. But wanted to have a united front and tried to push away homeland politics from a lot of their activities because it was just too divisive, or they thought so. So the Vietnamese could come together, the Indian Americans would have been split apart. Their command of English makes Indians more comfortable by comparison with Vietnamese in their initial forays into the public sphere, particularly in the local context. Through their voluntary and religious organizations, Indians partner with what they consider to be mainstream organizations on particular projects. They didn't talk about that, but actually within a lot of, they'll sort of work with Habitat for Humanity, or they'll distribute turkeys to the poor at Thanksgiving out of the Hindu temple, and do these things to sort of move them into the mainstream, but from the Hindu temple. But of course, forming chapters of the Lions Club is another way that Indian Americans do that, and we never found a Vietnamese Lions Club in our local area. So there are some interesting differences. Those with time and interest express little linguistic insecurity about participating in organizations like the PTA or the local citizens council. That's true of Indians, less so. Deborah didn't find Vietnamese mothers who were part of the PTA. I found several Indian mothers who were. For many in the first generation, that's a parent-teachers association, by the way, in public schools. For many in the first generation among the Vietnamese, the language barriers are paramount and often cited by research participants as an important issue. Very few Vietnamese refugees arrive with fluent English language skills, and for the first generation, this can prohibit participation in civic spheres like schools, local government, or other institutions. It also affects employment opportunities. Language is, however, less of a problem for the growing 1.5 generation and second generation, who are increasingly assuming leadership roles within these organizations. In this regard, we've been particularly struck by the capacity of both Indian and Vietnamese immigrants to talk the talk of civic engagement. That is, to learn the rhetoric of teamwork, good neighborship, giving back to the community, and entering the mainstream, then to shape their actions accordingly. Gerard Delanty emphasized that an important dimension of citizenship concerns the language that people use to make sense of their society, interpret their place in it, and construct a course of action. Our research substantiates this observation, but we would suggest further that adopting the language or rhetoric of civic engagement also involves a process of claims making. While Indian participants were more comfortable than Vietnamese participants with many of the phrases quoted above and used them more frequently, like teamwork, good neighborship, giving back to the community, use them more frequently, a reflection, no doubt, of their better English skills on the part of Indian Americans, the high levels of education and social class position. There certainly were contexts in which the Vietnamese used the rhetoric of civic engagement prevalent in the United States today. At the outset, I observed that citizenship is better defined not as an end state, but as a process of continuous evolution and progression. One community leader perhaps best articulated the processual and situated learning dimensions of civic engagement and substantive or participatory citizenship that our project attempted to describe and analyze. He said, community participation is a process. First, people get involved in their religious organizations. Then they get involved in an Indian community organization. Then they move to the next level outside the community with chambers, school boards, mainstream organizations. One is a stepping stone to the next. This is the path of the first generation. So again, that notion in the communities of practice theoretical literature of moving from periphery into the center, I think, is also captured by the way that this person sort of talked about the kind of his own experience and that of his community moving from the periphery to the center. Embedded in this observation, then, is an understanding that as an individual branches out, he or she is becoming involved with associations with greater civic or political presence, moving from one community of practice to another, and, as I said, from a peripheral position to one of greater participation. But equally, these activities illustrate how new immigrants construct their sense of belonging as they engage with and interpret what it means to be an American and what kind of American they want to be. I know this is a lot of data and complex, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.
Stay here.
Yes, we fall back up. Please join us. So we have about half an hour to have some questions and comments. So when you have a question, make sure it's a question. And if it's a comment, make sure it is brief, very brief. So, please join us.
Well, I can start trying. I know there are some of you who work on ethnic organizations or religious assemblies. I see there are panels, maybe people aren't here yet. But I'm wondering if anything that I said resonated with the kinds of things that you're finding in your own research. Let's start there.
One more question at the back.
Is there a mic or should I speak up?
Just speak up, please. We have a mic here, but
Well, this is getting based on previous research that I did, master's thesis that I wrote when I was in Chicago. I did my research my thesis back on Turkish festivals in Chicago. And I did deal with a lot of different, two actually, ethnic organizations. And I'm also an anthropologist. I'm doing my PhD right now on a separate topic. I know we're working in the US, but working in France now. And as I was shifting back and forth between one organization to the other, and just to clarify, they have two different festivals in the city of Chicago. This is a city of 8,000 to 10,000 Turks tops, two different festivals, and they're competing for some reason. for obvious reasons. That's fine. Did you see any kind of confrontation that's taking place among the Indian population, the second and third generation Indian migrants, that you were studying in terms of organizations, in terms of the festivals that they're organizing, in terms of the population that they're trying to address? If you could speak up a bit more about not the peaceful part of the story, but more of the, if there is any, of the ideological or whatever it is, battles that are taking place on ground.
Apparently I'm taking 2 or 3 questions, and then we're taking 2 or 3 questions.
Yes, my questions go to you as well. Thank you for the presentation. I'm just wondering whether there's a conflict between first and second and third generation, and whether they have a different understanding of community involvement and political activism in the second and third generation compared to the first one, perhaps.
My question again would be for you. I want to ask about the class dimension. As far as I understood, you have been doing research with more middle class immigrants. So what are the economically disadvantaged immigrants' position here?
Yeah. Okay. So 2 of them. Let me deal with the conflict. I think that I talked today about sort of larger. I mean, we have a lot of ethnic associations that we cover. And in fact, in another article, I've sort of used sort of concepts of bridging and bonding capital to kind of differentiate out these kind of levels of organization. And there are, I think, a lot of ethnic organization outlets. In the festival, I saw this as an attempt to really come together as a community. I mean, it is organized by the Umbrella Association that puts itself forward as representing the entire community and tries to suppress what might be regional differences or particularly religious differences, right? And sort of, and there's a lot of public relations to this. I mean, it's no accident that they invite these politicians, and they want to sort of present themselves in a particular way, both for a localized community or impacting sort of nationally. And I can't speak for any other city and any other set of festivals than the one that I actually did field work for. I mean, it's troubling for me and difficult for me to sort of generalize because this is such intense on the ground, as you know, on the ground field work. But I would say that because you have all these different kinds of organizations, I mean, there are about 100 Indian organizations in the DFW area, so that some of those issues for conflict. Now, not to say that you won't hear sniping about somebody's putting themselves forward as a leader, and why are they any better than we are? I mean, you do hear that in the background. Those kinds of conflicts that can be there. But when it sort of comes to the kind of public face, they're at least in that context. And I think because there are other outlets, so there are any number of regional associations, there are other kinds of cultural associations, there are other kinds of political organizations. Although, as I said, I didn't track down sort of an intense Hindu nationalist organization in DFW that I know exists in the bigger Indian communities on the East Coast and West Coast. So there it is, what's the nature of your population in the urban environment that you're in? What's the size of this population? The size can be critical mass to those kinds of things. So there are a lot of complex factors that go into that. I don't know if it answers your question. I'd be interested to know, what were the dividing lines between these two festivals. The second issue about this was our research was primarily on first generation. There are some second generation moving into these organizations. There are certainly in the religious assemblies second generation starting to take over, and they may have certain different ideas from the way that their parents sort of ran these institutions. So there can be tension and conflict as that transition occurs, but you have to follow it really long term to sort of fully capture that. And there's certainly in some of the other organizations sort of efforts to bring in the second generation who have much more powerful interests in the American mainstream.